everybody looks at America and say, are we Rome? And if you're conservatives, you usually say, well, the inflation is destroying our currency like it did with Rome, and tribalism is destroying us because, like Rome, we have lost the ability to unite people under a common language, common tradition, common culture, and expand from the idea that what was once largely an Anglo-Saxon population, then a pan-European population, then an Eastern European, then an Asian, along with the descendants of slaves, and then a Latin American population. We could keep reinventing America. We're losing that ability with tribal politics, wokeness, this new idea that to cure racism, you must be racist, or to stop discrimination, you must practice discrimination. That was a symptom of Roman decline along with inflation. Another idea was that we're dealing with is very similar to Rome, is that once you have a republican government, you forget that there were certain conditions that created it. There was a certain familiar place, there were certain familiar boundaries, there were certain familiar affinities. And when you expand that to Gaul, Hispania, Britannia, Germanic parts of southern Germania, Dalmatia, Arabia, Judea, then you have to say to yourself, the Italian paradigm will work all over the world for people who don't speak Italian, have never been to Italy, will never go to Italy, but the mindset will be the same. And it works if you work at it. If you teach people Latin all the time, and you make sure that all the architecture at Leptis Magna in Libya or in Iraq looks like it does in Italy, or everybody's on the same page with Roman law. But when you don't do that, and you say that that's unfair, or who you to put your values on other people, then it doesn't work. And so when we look at Rome, and I should say that there, scholars have noticed there's over 220 official published explanation for why Rome fell. But when we do look at Rome, I think you can see some affinities we all agree on. That the dollar is worth less and less each year. And we are printing money not on the basis of increased population and productivity, but just to print it. And that's a means of radical redistribution. That the debt that we're leaving to our children, each generation gets larger and larger. That people increasingly do not look like each other, which is okay, but increasingly they say to themselves that how I look is essential to who I am, and it's not incidental. And that's a pathway to destruction, as Rome learned with its own problems with tribalism. And then finally, I think this is very important, a nation has to have civic education. They have to know what the Constitution is. They have to know what the First Amendment is. They have to know what the Second Amendment is. They have to have some idea who the people were that died at Shiloh, what Okinawa was about, who died on a B-17 and why, who Andrew Jackson was, who Lincoln was, who Harriet Tubman was. We seem to know a lot about Harriet Tubman, but nobody knows who William Tecumseh Sherman was. So if you don't have models of your past, then you're not going to have any connection with it, and you're going to forget it, and you're going to make up the past as you go along. Or Orwell says, he who controls the present can reinvent the past to make a new future. And that's what we're doing in this country. A country also has to have humility. You can't use the standards of the present and go back and say, look at those guys in covered wagons. They said racist things, and therefore we're not going to study them, or the Oregon Trail should be not mentioned. Before you can do that, you have to say to yourself, if I have 5 children and 2 of them die on the Oregon Trail because they don't have antibiotics or they have diphtheria, or I have 2600 vision, but I can't get glasses and I can't see, or I don't know what the weather's going to be like tomorrow, I have no satellite. Or if I want a family of 5, my wife at 15 is going to have to be pregnant about 15 times because I know 5 births are not going to come to full term. Another 3 or 4, the child is going to be lost during childbirth. Another 2 or 3 are going to die from childhood diseases. Then she's not going to be emancipated because she's going to be pregnant from 15 to 40. And I'm not going to have any leisure time because I'm going to be trying to homestead a farm from 6 in the morning. But we've forgotten all that. So we have all these leisured creatures in the university that says, I judge this person racist, this person is sexist, this luminary is no good because they don't fit my standards of iPhones and vacuum cleaners and jet travel. And it's absolutely absurd. They have no idea, this generation, what the future is going to say to us. They could very well say, you and your scientific arrogance allowed 1 million fetuses that were viable children to be aborted in a single year. They may say that. Or they may say, wow, you guys went back to tribalism and started picking and choosing jobs and admissions by the color of people's skin. How reactionary was that? Every generation's got to be humble.
The American empire is coming to an end. The US economy is being drained by wars in the Middle East and vast military expansion across the globe. It is burdened by growing deficits, along with the devastating effects of deindustrialization and global trade agreements. Our democracy has been captured and destroyed by corporations that steadily demand more tax cuts, more deregulation, and impunity from prosecution for massive acts of financial fraud, all the while looting trillions from the US Treasury in the form of bailouts. The nation has lost the power and respect needed to induce allies in Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Africa to do its bidding. Add to this the mounting destruction caused by climate change, and you have a recipe for an emerging dystopia. Overseeing this descent at the highest levels of the federal and state governments is a motley collection of imbeciles, con artists, thieves, opportunists, and warmongering generals. And yes, I am also speaking about the Democratic Party. The empire will limp along, steadily losing influence until the dollar is dropped as the world's reserve currency, plunging the United States into a crippling depression and instantly forcing a massive contraction of our military machine. Short of a sudden and widespread popular revolt, which does not seem likely, the death spiral appears unstoppable, meaning the United States as we know it will no longer exist within a decade, or at most 2. The global vacuum we leave behind will be filled by China, already establishing itself as an economic and military juggernaut. Or perhaps there will be a multipolar world carved up among Russia, China, India, Brazil, Turkey, South Africa, and a few other states. Or maybe the void will be filled, as the historian Alfred McCoy writes, by a collection of transnational corporations, multilateral military forces like NATO, and an international financial leadership self-selected at Davos and Bilderberg that will forge a supranational nexus to supersede any nation or empire. Under every measure, from financial growth and infrastructure investment to advanced technology, including supercomputers, space weaponry, and cyber warfare, we are being rapidly overtaken by the Chinese. In April 2015, the US Department of Agriculture predicted that the American economy would grow by nearly 50% over the next 15 years, while China's economy is predicted to triple and come close to surpassing America's by 2030. China became the world's second largest economy in 2010, the same year it became the world's leading manufacturing nation, pushing aside a United States that had dominated the world's manufacturing for a century. The Department of Defense issued a sober report at our own peril, DoD risk assessment in a post-primacy world. It found that the U.S. military, and I quote, no longer enjoys an unassailable position versus state competitors, and it no longer can automatically generate consistent and sustained local military superiority at range. McCoy predicts the collapse will come by 2030. Empires in decay embrace an almost willful suicide, blinded by their hubris and unable to face the reality of their diminishing power. They retreat into a fantasy world where hard and unpleasant facts no longer intrude. They replace diplomacy, multilateralism, and politics with unilateral bombastic threats and the blunt instrument of war. This collective self-delusion saw the United States make the greatest strategic blunder in its history, one that sounded the death knell of the empire, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. The architects of the war in the George W. Bush White House and the array of useful idiots in the press and academia who were cheerleaders for it knew very little about the countries being invaded, were stunningly naive about the effects of industrial warfare, and were blindsided by the ferocious blowback. They stated and probably believed that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, although there was no valid evidence to support this claim. They insisted that democracy would be implanted in Baghdad and spread across the Middle East. They assured the public that US troops would be greeted by grateful Iraqis and Afghans as liberators. They promised that oil revenues would cover the cost of reconstruction. They insisted that bold and quick military strikes, shock and awe, would restore American hegemony in the region and dominance in the world. But it did the opposite. As Zbigniew Brzezinski noted, this unilateral war of choice against Iraq precipitated a widespread delegitimation of US foreign policy. Historians of empire call these military fiascos a feature of all late empires, micro-militarism. The Athenians engaged in micro-militarism when during the Peloponnesian War they invaded Sicily, suffering the loss of 200 ships and thousands of soldiers and triggering revolts throughout the empire. Britain did this in 1956 when it attacked Egypt in a dispute over the nationalization of the Suez Canal and then quickly had to withdraw in humiliation, empowering a string of Arab nationalist leaders such as Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, and dooming British rule over the nation's few remaining colonies. Neither of these empires recovered. While rising empires are often judicious, even rational in their application of armed force for conquest and control of overseas dominions, fading empires are inclined to ill-considered displays of power, dreaming of bold military masterstrokes that would somehow recoup lost prestige and power, McCoy writes. Often irrational, even from an imperial point of view, these micro-military operations can yield hemorrhaging expenditures or humiliating defeats that only accelerate the process already underway. But empires need more than force to dominate other nations. They need a mystique. This mystique, always a mask for imperial plunder, repression, and exploitation, seduces some native elites who become willing to do the bidding of the imperial power or at least remain passive. And it provides a patina of civility, even nobility, to justify to those at home the costs in blood and money needed to maintain empire. The parliamentary system of government that Britain replicated in appearance in its colonies, and the introduction of British sports such as polo, cricket, and horse racing, along with the elaborately uniformed viceroys and the pageantry of royalty, were buttressed by what the colonials said was the invincibility of their navy and their army. And England was able to hold its empire together from 1815 to 1914 before being forced into a steady retreat. America's high-blown rhetoric about democracy, liberty, and equality, along with basketball, baseball, and Hollywood, as well as our own deification of the military, entranced and cowed much of the globe in the wake of World War II. Behind the scenes, of course, the CIA used its bag of dirty tricks to orchestrate coups, fix elections, and carry out assassinations, black propaganda campaigns, bribery, blackmail, intimidation, and of course, torture. But none of this works anymore. The photographs of physical abuse and sexual humiliation imposed on Arab prisoners at Abu Ghraib inflamed the Muslim world. It fed al-Qaeda and later ISIS with recruits. The assassination of Osama bin Laden, he was unarmed, it's called assassination, and a host of other jihadist leaders, including the US citizen Anwar al-Awlaki, openly mocked the concept of the rule of law. The hundreds of thousands of dead and millions of refugees fleeing our debacles in the Middle East, along with the near constant threat from militarized aerial drones, exposed us as state terrorists. We have replicated in the Middle East the US military's penchant for widespread atrocities, indiscriminate violence, lies, and fatal miscalculations that led to our defeat in Vietnam. The brutality abroad is matched by a growing brutality at home. Militarized police gun down mostly unarmed, poor people of color, and fill a system of penitentiaries and jails that hold a staggering 25% of the world's prisoners, although Americans represent only 5% of the global population. Many of our cities are in ruins. Our public transportation is in shambles. Our educational system is in steep decline and being privatized. Opioid addiction, suicide, mass shootings, depression, and morbid obesity plague a population that has fallen into profound despair. The deep disillusionment and anger that led to Donald Trump's election, a reaction to the corporate coup d'etat, and the poverty afflicting at least half the country have destroyed the myth of a functioning democracy.